right.
Hey, bro, you gotta come closer to
Aboriginal son. I have to correct you on that. Okay. So Jesse Jackson didn't coin African American. That existed long before him. He just appropriated it and just made it a reheated thing. But it was, they were trying to use African American. Hold on, bro. So African American was used by these Negro sellout abolitionists back in slavery times underneath Afro-American. But turns out that Afro-American thing, Africans ain't know nothing about the Afro hairstyle. They already said that that's unique to the Americans. They even said cowboy shoes and jeans are also an American thing.
Can Aboriginal son finish what he was saying, please?
Go ahead.
Can we respect the people that's speaking? Yo, he has an opportunity to clear up his communications so everybody can hear him clearly. Let's allow him to finish what he was saying. Hey, hold on. I think you heard. Yeah, we hear you. Yes, please continue.
So before my stepfather died, he was telling me to go in his wallet, like a month before that. He was like, yo, go in my wallet and get my social security card. I went in his wallet, I couldn't find the social security card. I was like, yo, I don't see your card in here. He was like, yo, get my card, man. I was like, yo, I don't see your card in here. He was like, give me my wallet. He gave me the wallet. The social security card was metal. And it said Indian on it. And I looked at it and I was like, this is your social security card?
Don't be biting on my laptop.
I was like, I thought you was from Cleveland. He said, I was born in Kentucky. But then we left when we went to Cleveland. But the card said Indian and it bugged me out. But my real father, right, he always told me, we're not African. Our family came from Seneca Village in New York, and we was pushed out by the government.
So salute to the Seneca. I'm Seneca bloodline too. Yo, you already know, man. Yeah. Salute to the Seneca.
He said we was pushed out, and we were
from Senegal.
From Yonkers.
He said Seneca, not Senegal.
And then the Utica, New York. And I always used to listen to my ancestors tell me, like, you know, everything they told me, it was nothing about African. Everything was Indian. So they said, I said, what Indian are we? He said, we Lenape and Comanche Indian. And we came from Seneca Village, and that's it. So they said, yo, we not Lenape and Comanche Indians.
No, yo, Lenape, you gotta understand, you gotta hear the words, man. That they say Lenny Lenape, but the real bloodline people say Lenape though. You heard? Yo, understand the language. Understand the language and the frauds. The frauds is playing games with the words, man.
All right, let me just explain.
Ooh, that's fire.
All of our tribe names were changed, like all of the spellings. You know what I'm saying? The real spellings for Choctaw, Cherokee, all of that is spelled differently. You know what I'm saying? That's another way on how the 5 civilized tribes, that's not us.
Hey, to your point, man. To your point, man. So, yo, my Turner lineage, all right, because I'm a Turner about blood as well. The Turner is tapped in with the Seneca. It's a part of the Powhatan Confederacy and all of that. Now, check it. Cherwin Haka Nadawa.
Oh, for sure.
Cherwin Haka Nadawa. And so, how the foreigners say, they say Nottoway. The Nottoway is not Nadawa, though. You understand? Nottoway is not Nadawa. We the people of the 3 rivers. They don't even know what the 3 rivers is.
Yeah, all of the languages
understand?
They have, bro. All of the languages that they have.
Wait, are you saying that, like, the federally recognized tribes?
Cherokee, they're not federally recognized. They're state recognized.
Yeah.
So the state one are...
Hey, but peep game. Let me tell y'all something though.
I didn't know that there were state recognized tribes. So,
but hold on.
Yamasi are state recognized. Pamunkey, Powhatan.
Let me drop something real quick. Let me drop something real quick. So peep game, right? See, when you know the legal process, all right? Hey, yo, you can gain federal recognition as an individual, and you can represent for all of your people via a legal process. You heard? You ain't gotta be with the state, federal, or the state recognition, the overall federal.
Welcome back,
recognition.
American
No.
Soul.
All you gotta do is put your shit on record.
Listen,
You understand?
listen,
My people's is thoroughly documented, man. I'm a turner by blood. You heard?
Hold on, bro.
Yeah.
A lot of people, you know what I'm saying, that's the problem today, right? The federally recognized people, right? A lot of them have stole our identities. They have been having judiciary duties, like they've been literally acting as trustee and beneficiary over our shit. Right. So what I say is this, right? Because it's over with for them. They got to literally go. So what I'm saying is, do your genealogy. You cannot be an individual is invisible. So the reason why they say that, because look up the individual Indian money accounts, okay? They only use that term because they are looking at us as we are DEAD. Look up the DEAD Indian.
You call yourself black.
My bad, no. GT.
Right. Yeah, but it's the DEAD Indian Act. You get what I'm saying? Because we haven't claimed our lineage. We haven't claimed our heir.
It's in probate.
See what I'm saying? Right. So we have accounts. Are y'all listening? That is in the 10 digits, bro.
They have my body to work. Go body it. Run it down on them.
They have.
It's called the Strawman's account. And creating the Strawman's account to take everything away from us. They create.
So Aboriginal son, hold on. She's saying something very specific and direct right now pertaining to the subject matter. So the straw man is separate. Hey, yo, receipt goddess, please continue. Don't lose your thought.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, right? They had people in the 1970s storm in there. These know-nothings, you know what I'm saying? In Minnesota, they came up with the American Indian movement. They aren't American Indians, you know what I'm saying? So they stormed there, they squatted there for 7 days. They created like over $700,000 worth of damage. They stole our records, right? Since then, the Department of Interior, there's so many other ones, right? These people have been acting as trustee and beneficiary over our stuff, right? So what I'm saying is, you cannot claim your heir being a citizen, a U.S. citizen, because these people are literally naturalized citizens. In order to be a naturalized citizen, that means you have to be a foreigner, right? So foreigners, they have been self-identifying.
Hey, hold on. Yo, she's dropping a lot of serious information for those that know, all right? Those that are astute, that have studied and etc., that's doing the work. Yo, everything she's saying right now makes perfect sense, and this is applicable. Okay, you can really get busy with this, man.
So for one, Black Superman said that he's not a citizen.
You don't even know what a citizen is, man. Stop
he said he an African. He's not a United States person.
You're a super Negro. Fall back, super Negro. Fall back, super Negro. Yes, you get Negro benefits. I get it, but guess what? You can get deported, super Negro. That's a fact.
You never get deported.
Super Negro.
Then if you can't get deported, what are you then?
Hey.
Is she back?
Everybody, trying to talk, y'all.
Oh, I was asking if you were done with receipt, goddess.
No.
Man, you go ahead and finish. Go ahead, Lane.
I don't even know where I was at, but just you cannot be a U.S. citizen, okay? You have to understand about the birth certificate. You know what I'm saying? The fact that they have duplicated our social security numbers. You feel what I'm saying? That's another reason why the Biden administration flooded those people over here. You get what I'm saying? So when you understand, the first thing that Trump did was he has signed something for these people to make billions of dollars.
Hey, this woman thorough, y'all. Hey, y'all better listen, y'all.
Yeah, hold on real quick. This is how she loses her train of thought.
I lose my train of thought. But just follow me. I can break it down when I do go live. Because I know it's other people that want to talk, but just know that there's some things that's done, but it's nothing to be afraid of. It's nothing to be confused about. It's real simple. You basically let me slow down. Allowing them to continue to tell you who you are is keeping them in positions of power. Just realize that. Now, when you claim your lineage, see, it's more than just your tribe. It's a bloodline. See, they are all associated and affiliated for one common thing, to take our shit. We have a bloodline. That's it. That's all I want to say for now.
Oh yeah, who's this guy?
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Hold on, one second. I gotta keep repeating myself, man. Who's this Gotti dude? Because if you ain't gonna come up here, so a mod can mute him or kick him. I don't really care. Talking about some, because why are you coming in the live threatening folks? Like, why are you coming to a live threatening folks? Huh?
No, who threatened who though? Hold on, let me see that. Let me see who did that.
Look at the comments.
Gotti represents.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I
don't even claim. I don't even claim FBA, right? But you ain't gonna come up here and talk like that about them folks, all right? Like, relax.
Yeah, and that FBA shit is pseudo. It's just a knockoff of African Americans and Africans.
Man, hold on, you Italian? Hold on. You a Gotti, right? You an Italian, right? What you talking about? What's going on here? What's going on here? Hold on. Who you talking about the disrespect to ancestors? What are you talking about? You Italian. What are you talking about? Whose ancestors?
Y'all guys don't leave them crazy.
Hey man, come on, yo. This is funny to me. My ancestors got busy with the Gottis, you heard? Like, come on, man. Yo, we know the Gotti work. What are they talking about? I ain't supposed to be talking like this right now.
Bro, he rocking that Tariq Nasheed shit.
Thank you to Susan. But, yeah.
Tomahawk Tony, he rocking that Tariq Nasheed shit. So we already know where his camp is.
Hey, let me just double back because we got some people in the comments that's confused about what Receipt Goddess was just saying real quick. So check it. Y'all need to understand what a trustee is, for one. Okay? You gotta understand what a beneficiary is, for two. Okay? You need to understand trust law, for three. Those three things right there go together. All right. Now, there is via our treaties, our Aboriginal American nations, okay, we have treaties with the colonists, the primary colonists. Who is the primary colonists? Britain, Spain, France, the Vatican,
the Dutch.
Those are the primary three. Now, you also have the vassal nations, the British are vassal nations, the French, the Dutch, the Germans, etc. They're also vassal nations under the Vatican. You don't understand colonization until you do the proper research. You have to conduct the proper research. Now, in regards to our Aboriginal American nations peoples, all right, this is why genealogy is important. Because now you can identify who your people are, all right, and your people's relationship via the nations that you are descendant of, that you are a natural citizen to. This is why that Native American membership shit don't mean nothing. You understand? Membership versus citizenship. There's a difference. All right? Now, continuing. Now, I'm just going to conclude with this point. If you don't know these basics, if you don't know your bloodline, you don't know your people, guess what? Yo, you confused and you lost. That's it. That's all. I'm on mute again.
Yeah, I'm about to wrap. I'm about to hop off here. I'm about to wrap it up. Yes, appreciate y'all coming through. Yeah, thank you for if people want to come up and being here goofy in the comments, if you have a mod badge, then block them. And they being OD disrespectful, like threatening people and things like that. But yeah, until next time, peace, y'all.
Peace. Oh, join me on my live.
Peace, y'all.
Tyron Leon. Peace. All right. So now that that's over, we can get into this Dynastamir situation. So I went on this man's platform, and he said a lot of pseudo shit, bringing up the usual Pan-African tactics, Henry Louis Gates, the DNA, and all this other stuff, which we already know the bias behind this. And for those who know, I'm not hiding my DNA. This is public knowledge, so here it is. So when we break down this DNA stuff, I don't really have any relatives from Africa. They're just throwing out there people that's in the distant past that are somewhere in my genetics, but through recombination, I'm not even related to these people. My recent relatives that they show on here would be so-called African diaspora groups that are already admixed within the United States who are indigenous Americans. So it says that I'm African diaspora, Yadkin PD, Basin, African Americans. Okay, who are the Yadkin PD? These are Muskogean speaking people from the Southeast, particularly in South Carolina. They're also saying I'm South Carolina Low Country Gullah. And they're saying I'm Upper Cape Fear African Americans, Southern Low Country Gullah. These are indigenous groups and Black Americans that are interwoven. They're Muskogee speaking ethnic groups. So with people sitting up here saying that Black Americans don't have their own ethnic identities, here it is, because it's a long list of different Black Americans that's connected to indigenous names and counties and places within the United States. So I'm going to play a clip of this individual trying to use Henry Louis Gates as a credible source when we already know his agenda behind this back to Africa stuff. Give me a moment. All right, where's the thing? Yes. All right, so I'm about to play a clip from Rick Kittles and Henry Louis Gates video. Yeah, I should try that video. Give me a few seconds.
If they did a test, could
Fair
you,
use
with a scientific degree of accuracy, say you do not have Native American blood?
What we would say is, first of all, which line of the family tree, which branch of the family tree is Native American? Okay. And then they would have to test that branch.
Okay.
And if that test comes back without Native American ancestry, then we would say there is no Native American ancestry on this branch of the family tree.
Uh-huh.
It may be on other branches, but we didn't test those.
Uh-huh.
So they have to look at one branch of the family tree in order for us to be that
welcome.
Specific.
Stop the cow. No bullshit, bro. So when you say branch, are you talking about the mother or the father?
You got more than two branches. You've got 4 branches when you go back 2 generations, because you've got those 4 grandparents.
Okay.
You've got 8 branches when you go back another generation because of your great grandparents. And if you go back 10 generations, there are over 1,000 branches to your family tree.
Okay. So you say that overwhelmingly, when you test African Americans, Americans who have maintained that they have native blood, you don't find it.
Right, but let me also be very clear with this, because you're asking these definitives. The interesting thing about African Americans is that we're not one homogeneous, monolithic group.
Now this is from Wanagi's channel. All right, I'm about to play another clip that contradicts these Pan-African cats that constantly try and browbeat Black Americans with this West African DNA stuff from their own sources. So bear with me, because these guys that they use tend to cherry pick a lot of information within Black American history. So when they're criticizing you, oh, and by the way, New Era, happy birthday. So initially what these Pan-Africans try to do, they try and use these cats trying to claim that, oh, Indians never mix with anybody. They maintain a racial homogeneity, and they follow white supremacy to a T, when how the fuck could white people monitor people interracially mixing? And two, this nigga is being disingenuous because it's heavily documented that Negroes and Indians mixed, and Negroes were underneath Indian oppression, and they spoke fluently Indian dialects, deciphered a whole bunch of tribes, languages, and things of that nature. So they tend to go to finding your roots. They tend to go to this lecture that he held over in California in Claudio San. Give me a moment. Yeah.
Cut to 1977. You could say, what's the greatest event in the history of miniseries and TV? Roots. So you could say since 1977, I've had one serious case of Roots envy. I had this little composition book. I could go back to my great-great-grandmother on my father's side. On my mother's side, great-grandmother. But that was it. There was Alex Haley coming out of the blue, could go all the way to Africa. He could go to this ship that brought his African ancestors over, and then he went all the way back to Gambia. So I was totally jealous of Alex Haley. And I had a profound and severe case of Roots envy. But I figured, well, I'll never, only Alex Haley could do that, right? So I got to know Quincy Jones in 1999. Anthony Appiah, my dear friend, and I edited the Africana Encyclopedia. And then we founded Africana.com, which we needed some investors. And by this time, it's complicated, but I got to be friends with Quincy Jones, still a great friend of mine. And Quincy introduced me to Alex Haley. And more than that, Quincy, it turned out, was obsessed with genealogy as well. Quincy scored the music for Roots. So for Christmas, he would give people their family trees. So, I thought about that, and but there was nothing I could do about that. Well, here's a funny thing happened. You never know. The Bible says, be careful what you wish for. In the year 2000, a young Black geneticist named Dr. Rick Kittles, who at the time was teaching at Howard University, sent me a letter. He's now at the University of Chicago Medical School. He said that he was asking various African-American men if they would submit themselves to this new test. And through this test, he could trace on your mother's line where in Africa you were from. Man, that was some serious stuff. And I said, yeah, I called him right away. And I said, definitely. And he said that of all the people he'd written to, nobody was writing him back. And I couldn't figure out why, but I later found out why. So I said, would you want me to come to Washington? He goes, no, I'll come up to Harvard Square. It's where I was living. So about a week later, he showed up. And now I've had many operations. I broke my hip when I was playing football when I was about 14. It was misdiagnosed by country. Cut to 1977.
Give me a second. So I'm going to skim through some of the video, and he's going to reveal that DNA is not really supposed to be taken that seriously and that they're just testing theories.
Where they were shipped from. So, what are you talking about? Oprah Winfrey was calling me. From the time I was 9 years old.
All right.
People don't call, powerful people don't call you a bad news. Somebody told me that a long time ago. If she was calling, it was good news. She didn't call and say, I got your letter and no. And don't write me again. She said, I'd be honored to be in the series. Now, students, why is this important? Because to do the series, I needed $6 million. And what are you talking about? Oprah Winfrey. In genealogy. And I would get 8 prominent African Americans, and I would trace their family tree back into the abyss of slavery, back to the time when the paper trail disappears, because inevitably it disappears for all of us, all of our ancestors. It just wasn't a paper trail. You can't trace people, there's no printed record. And then when the paper trail disappears, I would do their DNA and tell them where they were from in Africa. I was so excited, I had tears in my eyes, and I couldn't wait till the next day. The next day I called my buddy Quincy Jones. Now Quincy is like a vampire. Quincy is up all night long because he was a jazz musician. And when the sun comes up, he goes to bed. So you can't do business with Quincy till after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's just the way it is. So I waited till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I called out to Bel Air, or up to Bel Air now. Yeah, I forget where I am, San Diego. And I said, and he picked up me, and this person put him on the line. I said, Q, would you, if I could do for you what Alex did, would you be in a PBS series? I had no money. I had nothing. Just an idea. And this is very important to the students. I just had an idea. And I said, would you be in it? And he said, could you do that? And I said, yeah. He said, does it hurt? And I lied and said, no, it doesn't hurt. I said, are you in? He said, I'm in. Now, who's his best friend? Oprah Winfrey. So I said, okay, man, you're in. I waited, beat. I said, would you call Oprah and ask her to be in? He went, no. But he said, I'm going to do something, because everybody hustles Oprah. And if you're a friend, you can't be bringing ideas, because people want Oprah to write a check to do everything. So he said, I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to give you her secret name and address. And you write her a letter. And no guarantees, man. And so I wrote a letter, Dear Ms. Winfrey. And, I figured it's like throwing a message in a bottle, throwing it in the ocean, right? A week later, it was a Sunday, my cell phone rang and it was Quincy calling. And I said, hey, Q, what's happening? And a deep woman's voice said, Dr. Gates, this is Oprah Winfrey. Thank you, Jesus. From the time I called Rick Kittles. And I said, Rick, did you tell Oprah she was a Zulu? He goes, no, man, she made that up herself. I was 9 years old. It's a true story. It's a true story. I would lie to make you laugh, but I'm telling you a true story. So I said, Rick, are you in your lab? He said, yeah. I said, is anybody there? He said, no. I said, when the results come in, make her Zulu, man. I said, you back there making it up anyway. Nobody believe you could take some spit and figure out a tribe? What are you, crazy? So anyway, I was a Nubian and it was cool. Well, here's the miracle, one of the many miracles, thank God, that happened in my life. I called Rick Kittles. I get a raise at Harvard, so it's cool. So I attack him, we do what Malcolm and Martin couldn't do. Set it up, then we go split the money and slap five and go to Sylvia's, have fried chicken. Believe me, that's a much better way to function than hating each other. So I called Malefi first thing. I said, Malefi, I just got my results back. I am a Nubian. Where are you from? I am the true African prince. My friend Anthony Appiah, whose uncle was the Asantehene, the king of the Asante people. And when Rick Kittle sent me a certificate announcing I was Nubian, Anthony Appiah looked at it and said, "What a ton of rubbish." Now, why would he say that? Well, there's a slight problem with being either Zulu or Nubian if you're African American. You know what the problem is? None of our ancestors who came here in slavery came from South Africa, the Zulu people, or from Nubia. None. Zero. Egypt is over here. The slaves came from the area of...
Here's where this man is lying, because how did my Y chromosome come back as Ramses III? See, this is where these pseudos are lying, because if I'm supposedly an African, why are they throwing out here my Y chromosome is Ramses III? I thought that shit was lost through recombination. You can't go back to no ancestor in the BCE, right? But the autosomal sitting up here giving me 68% West African, but not specific enough. It just says close somewhere in my ancestry, but it's over here giving me no African relatives whatsoever. It's giving me Black American relatives, white relatives, Asian relatives, and even American Indian relatives. That's unspecified because their database is only limited to groups that are not of Southeastern groups, only people from the South, West, Latin America, and Alaska. So this is where DNA companies are often fraudulent, because they're just giving you percentages and nothing definitive. And then when I took the ancestry test, it gave me different results. It gave me 1% American Indian. On the 23andMe, it gave me 0.7% American Indian. But they all say that my ancestral groups come from Black American communities that are Muskogean-speaking people, like the Gullahs, like the Yadkin PD, all these low country people from South Carolina that are indigenous and Negro admix with alleged Africans. So this is what debunks Dynasty Amir's talking points and anti-indigenous rhetoric. So let's go back and go over some of these clips that this nigga said, claiming that Indians never admix, or that our grandparents are lying allegedly.
These series, I found the big three myths of African American genealogy. The first one is that I am descended from an Igbo princess, and she was so beautiful that her foot never touched the sordid soil of slavery. That there was a German count.
How is this a myth if, for one, you had a whole bunch of free Negroes in Africa, such as the Anacolas Pippin, the famous Gory Island niggas hold their hats on, claiming, oh, it's a slave dungeon. It was a slave dungeon. Those weren't even used as dungeons or penitentiaries whatsoever. They said that Africans were held at the beach in wooden cages called barracoons. There's no physical evidence of barracoons, let alone physical evidence of these forts being used as slave dungeons. What evidence there is these forts were used to stock up ships with cargo to sell around the African continent, to go to Asia to sell textiles. That's what they were initially used for. But people like the UNESCO and these Africans and George Bush, Bill Clinton, and all these, and the Pope made these places as monumental sites for history to get people riled up in emotional sensationalism rather than factual historical proof. And this is where these Afrocentrics is sitting up here lying and being disingenuous to Black Americans, keeping them stuck in this victimization mentality rather than getting them some restitution, some reparations. They're selling you on a Back to Africa movement scam. So let's continue, because he said Igbo princess stuff because you had free black people in the Caribbean that were full-blooded black mulattoes that were running the show with the white boy. And in Africa, you had a lot of African rulers that participated in selling their own people over here, which Henry Louis Gates also believes that it's all Africans' fault for this transatlantic slave trade to avoid white people for giving them white guilt and all this other shit. Well, let's continue, because he put that Igbo princess myth in there, even though nobody ever says this, just him.
Walking by the shipyard, the docks in Charleston, and he looked over and saw my great-great-grandmother and said, man, she is fine. That is my Igbo princess. And he goes and he buys her and makes her his wife, and they live happily.
What up, Lady Warrior?
It never happened. Never happened. Malcolm Gladwell. I was on Martha's Vineyard. A couple sons said, we were never slaves. Look at point number 2. Because my great-great-grandmother was an Igbo princess. And there was a German walking by, and he bought it. I go, oh, really? And the next day, and I told her that was true. She got very angry at me, so I decided to be cool about how I told people that they were believing myths. The next day, Malcolm Gladwell was in my last series, Face of America. I called him, and I said, Malcolm, would you be in my new series? He said, yeah. And I said, how far can you trace your ancestry? He said, oh, man, I'm so glad I got somebody to tell. You know, we found out I'm descended from an Igbo prince. I go, yeah, I heard that story. A series, a Y-DNA test. The reason the men are men in this room is because of Y-DNA, but women don't have Y-DNA. We all have mitochondrial DNA. And your mitochondrial DNA, you inherit from your mother. Your Y-DNA from your father, if you're a man, is exact.
That's not the video.
A series, I found the big 3 myths of African American genealogy. The first one is that I am descended from an Igbo princess.
No.
And she was so beautiful. I want everybody to be honest. Just the African Americans in this room. How many of you are descended from a Native American? Just raise your hand. Don't be ashamed. There you go. Look at all them Native Americans. Well, I got news for you. None of y'all are descended from Native Americans. My grandmother had high cheekbones and straight black hair. Every Negro I know claimed that in 1950. Well, guess what the DNA evidence shows? Only 5% of the African American people, 1 out of 20, have any significant Native American ancestry. But 1 out of 20. But on the other hand, 58% of the African American people have a significant amount of white ancestry. You know that those high cheekbones and straight black hair? That came from.
This is the disingenuous part of Dinah Samir's claim, because for one, DNA was only primarily used on Europeans. That's where they're getting their reference panels from, are white people exclusively. So they do not represent people of color properly, because they're just now getting access to a large amount of African DNA with Ancestry and 23andMe and Rick Kittle's African Ancestry. African Ancestry is the only one with the largest African database, whereas Ancestry.com is only 14 regions, which it's a bunch of countries, and they use Sub-Sahara, Bantu, and all this other stuff, which that's not a great representation of ancient African kingdoms that don't even exist anymore. And these modern Africans are also admixed with Black American genetics. They also don't consider American Indian genetics because they're not taking samples from those that were involved into the transatlantic slave trade, because Native Americans are elitists over their own genetics, fossils, and artifacts, because they believe in the sacred over science. You can look up Kim Tallbear, and she breaks this down wonderfully in her dissertations about people using DNA tests to prove Indianness, because a lot of individuals use these DNA tests to commit fraud against tribal enrollment, such as the dog named the Chihuahua named Snoopy, and some other dogs that they send in DNA of the canine DNA, and it came back as human genetics, and they try to fraudulently claim indigenous American ancestry through canine DNA. So it's very disingenuous from these Afrocentric Pan-Africans to try and browbeat Black Americans with these DNA tests when they're not accurate enough and the science isn't there to give any definitives. And through recombination, like I showed earlier, Rick Kittle's his colleague or girlfriend, whatever she was, on the Rock Newman show, they said they have to figure out which branch is this American Indian DNA on. And with my genetic test results, they're putting my Indianness on my Y chromosome, which we don't really know what specific indigenous tribe they were. Is dating all the way back to the 1730s, which DNA tests cannot take you back to the colonial period. Only it can take you to the late antebellum, post antebellum, going into Reconstruction cowboy era. That's how far DNA can take you through 8 generations. It can't go beyond that. So if people were identifying as American Indian in that time frame, it's going to be pretty hard to get to them, because records, you have like Walter Plecker erasing people's records, and you also have white supremacists trying to prevent Black Americans from getting any tangibles. And I can take my genealogy back to people that are old reparations and are on the Southern Claims Commission. So let's get back to the video, because Afrocentrics love this clip.
Your white great-great-grandfather. The average African American and the average Native American never saw each other. I don't know about you all, but you can't sleep with, the internet can do a lot, but you can't sleep with somebody you can't see. The average admixture for African Americans is, the average Black person is 77% Black, 17.5% European, and 5% Native American. Now, I was telling the students this morning, I went to see LeBron lose against the Celtics on Tuesday. I want everybody to be honest. Just the African Americans in this room.
All right. So he made that statement.
And determine where in Africa our forebears were from. Among those using the test to trace their family's past, Spike Lee, Oprah Winfrey, and actor Isaiah Washington, one of the stars of Grey's Anatomy.
Brother Washington, your mitochondrial DNA is quite common among the Mende and Temne people in Sierra Leone.
What you talking about? What you talking about? What you talking about, bro? Got him! Got him!
Trace their ancestry back to Africa, a history totally lost to them.
You think about young African Americans growing up thinking that the history started with slavery. I mean, how do you think that impacts their psyche? We went through slavery. We didn't start with slavery.
To Vi Higginson, the prospect of tracing even a tiny fraction of her ancestry back to Africa was enthralling. 60 Minutes sent her DNA to African Ancestry, as well as to several other genetic genealogy companies, to see what they could tell us about Vi's maternal lineage.
I'm sitting on the edge of my seat.
Kittle's company sent Vi what they call a certificate of ancestry.
Oh my God.
It says that you share maternal genetic ancestry with people from the Mende tribe in Sierra Leone. Do you know anything about Sierra Leone or the Mende people? No, nothing.
People have been waiting a lifetime for something like this. Now, this is just a tiny bit of information now.
But they take it as huge.
Right, because it's cracking open the door that was closed for centuries.
There's a place in Africa you could say that I'm from. A tribe. I am thrilled. It puts a name, a place, a location, a people. It opens up such possibilities.
But the problem is, Sierra Leone wasn't the only answer Vi got. A company called Relative Genetics found a match to a single person in the Wobi tribe in the Ivory Coast.
Different? Now, I got all excited about that, and this is different. Now, how could that happen?
Then a third company, Trace Genetics. Your particular sequence matches sequences reported among multiple Mendenka individuals in Senegal. What's up with this? And Family Tree DNA, the company that linked Vi with Marion in the first place, came up with a whole list of matches. This goes on and on.
My goodness.
Got it! And determine where in Africa our forebears were from. Among those using the...
This is so offensive. How do you decrease my Nigerian? How do you decrease my Nigerian ancestry from 46% to only 6%? What the scam? What is going on?
Got it! Got it!
They're unique to your maternal lineage. We analyze the variants within these regions to determine the parts of your DNA that you share with people within specific ethnic groups. Are you trying to tell me I'm white? I'm so confused. The HVR variants listed below indicate DNA sequence patterns that you share with European populations. The combinations of HVR variants determine your membership. The sequence similarity score represents our 100% confidence level in your result. Haplogroup H, sequence similarity score 100%. And then they have the nerve to say, we understand that this information may be difficult to absorb, you think? Especially if you were not aware of any European ancestry on your mother's maternal line. It is important to note that even though we did not find African ancestry for your maternal lineage, it does not mean that you are not African American. It does not mean that your mother is not African American, and it does not mean that you have no African ancestry anywhere in your family tree. Please feel free to contact one of the specialists in our offices to test other lineages that you can test to find your African roots.
Now that's a mitochondrial.
Can you guys see this? It legitimately says...
Yeah, she took a Rick Kittles test.
You're not African.
Got it!
This is so offensive. How do you decrease my Nigerian? How do you decrease my Nigerian? Okay,
so through recombination, you're not related to all of your ancestors. Play this white woman right here.
Sudan, Somalia, Uganda, Guinea, Rwanda, and Tanzania. Okay. So number one is Sudan. So I am 3% African. I missed Black History Month last month.
Got it! Got it!
So what do we know about Vi's ancestry? The DNA does indicate that she has distant relatives in the Mende tribe, but she also has relatives in all those other tribes. So no one can say for sure where Vi's maternal ancestor actually came from. When I handed Vi the certificate, she got extremely emotional about it. She wept, and it meant so very much.
People want to believe.
They want to believe they've gotten an answer.
And it's not fair of us to let them believe that we're giving them certain answers because scientifically, we just can't.
Hank Greeley is concerned that the science isn't really there yet for you to be giving them the name of a tribe.
I think for most companies, I would be concerned too.
What about your own company?
We have
He didn't exclude you. He included you.
But we have the largest set of sequences from Africa. So with that, we're able to provide some level of probability in terms of frequency.
So what he doesn't admit is his company doesn't offer autosomal tests. Only Ancestry and 23andMe and all these other ones offer autosomal. He only provides the Y chromosome test and the mitochondrial chromosome test, and you got to pay damn near $1,000 just to take both tests, which ain't nobody trying to do it. They rather get a cheaper alternative. And he doesn't include indigenous American genetics in his company. And I called African Ancestry about this, and they never got back to me about my questions about him. And I even sent this man an email. So this is how disingenuous Rick Kittle's integrity is, because they're over here propping up this fake ass African slave story and trying to erase people's indigenousness by coming up with bullshit. So, and this is what your niggas Dynasty Mir and YK the Truth and Not a Coincidence, all these goofy ass niggas running with. It's a bunch of people that ain't got no science to give you definitives on what your ethnic group is. They're just trying to reach back into a bit of BCE rather than telling you what your relatives is now that's relevant to you being in the United States. They want to homogenously clump Black Americans with tethers. So yes, I'm all for this so-called diaspora war.
He would say that even though you have the largest database, it's still small on the scope of things.
As I said, I share those concerns
About yourself.
at DNA.
And that's the rub. This business of genetic genealogy is fraught with limitations. For one thing, it can only provide information about a tiny fraction of our ancestry. Because we get half our DNA from our mothers and half from our fathers, almost all of our DNA gets shuffled and remixed every generation, making it impossible to trace what comes from whom. There are just 2 bits of DNA that remain pure: the Y chromosome, which passes directly from father to son, and something called mitochondrial DNA, which passes unchanged from mother to child. Hank Greeley, a law professor at Stanford University, has studied this new field. He worries that people don't realize just how many ancestors they actually have.
8 generations ago, both you and I had 256 great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents.
Wait, you're saying that if you go back 8 generations, we have 256 great-great-great-grandparents?
Yes, it doubles every generation. So you've got 2 parents, you have 4 grandparents, you have 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, and it adds up fast.
Europe. Okay, so Sudan, some Algerian ancestry.
But if you go back 20 generations, you've got over 1 million grandparents.
1,048,576 to be exact. And in each generation, DNA testing can provide information about only 2 of them.
So you could be Peruvian on your mother's side, Japanese on your father's side, Swedish on everything else.
And you'll never know.
And you'll never know the Swedish from the Y chromosome or the mitochondrial DNA.
Now, you've looked at several of these companies that are doing these tests.
Yes.
Do you think that they explain what you just explained to us?
No, I don't think any of them does as good a job of pointing out the limitations. But, businesses often don't go around telling you how weak their product is.
We don't oversell. I mean, we just say, look, we provide a service. If you're interested in exploring a tiny bit of your DNA and trace its ancestry, we can do that.
When you say it's a tiny little amount,
It's less than 0.1%. It's less than 0.1%. It's less than 0.1%.
that's pretty teeny.
Yeah, but for people who know nothing about any of them, I think it's very important.
So you a fake ass less than 1% African. He over here wandering Africa trying to sell you on moving there, when this nigga can't even tell you what specific tribe he come from. He over here claiming to be a Nigerian citizen. He can't even tell me what tribe he descends.
Hi, I'm Rick Kittles, co-founder and scientific director of African Ancestry. In my travels around the country, I meet a lot of people, and many of them have the same questions. And so I thought it would be a good opportunity now to answer questions that you may have. Well, the lab process is pretty routine. It's a simple cheek swab where the individual gets their test kit, fills out the forms, they get a swab, and they swab the inside of their mouth on their cheek cells. Cheek cells are deposited on that swab. They place it in the envelope and ship it to us. We then get the swab and do some chemical analyses to release the DNA from the cells, and we do DNA sequencing, where we actually sequence the DNA to examine the individual genetic profile. Once that data is generated, it goes to me, where I look at that profile in the context of our African lineage database. And so I look for matches, and I look for where this lineage is more common and where it's found at in Africa.
So what Rick Kittles doesn't tell you is, with his company, he provides a Y chromosome test and a mitochondrial test. So these DNA tests are DNA that does not change. It maintains itself, going all the way back to the first Homo sapiens sapiens. So it's basically out of Africa noise. So when it's dealing with you in particular, when you want to find out all the ethnicities that consist in your genetics, is the autosomal test, which most of these DNA tests that are white run or Jewish run, it gives you all the people that are mixed up in your genealogy. But when it comes to indigenous American markers, it's going to be harder to find, because during chattel slavery, American Indian slavery lasted from particularly in the United States, from the 1500s all the way up to the 1790, and alleged African slavery, it was from 1626 to 1807, if I'm not mistaken. And so what these clowns do is, what Rick Kittles tried to do was claim that Black Americans are only admixed with white and black and no Indian at all, which that's pseudo in his statement, because American Indians were already predominantly chattel within the United States, and Africans were a minute number. He even says this shit. He says only 5% of the transatlantic slave trade was dropped off here in the United States alone. So doing the math, his math ain't really mathing, because the Palankage sex farm theory doesn't even make any sense, because they were already utilizing indigenous females. African women weren't here in the colonial period like that. They gradually brought them in over time with white women, but initially African males that were brought here, they were bred with indigenous females to produce more chattel slaves. And then over time, those indigenous chattel slaves mixed into one another, and those offspring became admixed. So, well, in South America, they use the term Zambo. Up here, they use Sambo. No. They use different types of terms like mulatto, which that can mean anything like an admix between a Negro slave and an Indian woman, or it could be a white person mixed with a Negro, or a white person mixed with an Indian. So this is disingenuous on Henry Louis Gates' part, because he wants to bring up a Sally Hemings and what's his name, Thomas Jefferson scenario, like white men was hogging up all the African vagina to themselves on a sex farm. So that would mean that Black American men's Y chromosome would be white men, and that would mean Black women's mitochondrial would be an indigenous American female, especially going back to the colonial period. So again, this guy is being very disingenuous, because he also took a DNA samples from that woman, Lena Waithe, from off of the Chicago, whatever that shit, that show, that lesbian ass show that's on Showtime. And what's this other black woman's name? She's a professor. Her name escapes me at the moment, but they found that their mitochondrial DNA was exclusive to the Americas. And he over here mocking, saying, "Oh, you are the only black person that can claim that they are Cherokee princesses." So it shows and proves that Henry Louis Gates' integrity is coon made. So let's continue to the videos, because we're gonna get to that eventually, because he loves tap dancing for white people.
That process is pretty routine now. We've been doing it for over 10 years, and it's a pretty straightforward and standard process. Once I examine the individual's profile and compare it to our database of African lineages and find matches, I then send that information to the offices in DC, and they prepare the results package.
So, and by the way, you know the Zulu thing? When Oprah was finally in the first series.
If y'all can see that, it's kind of blurry.
Many people wonder, when their results come back and one of these lineages is European, does it mean that they're 100% European? The answer is no. Remember, African Americans are very mixed in terms of ethnicity and ancestry because of the experience of the transatlantic slave trade. And so immediately upon arrival here in North America, there was a lot of mixing going on. And so we see remnants of that in the DNA of African Americans.
So
a lot of men,
if there was a lot of mixing in the United States, where did the Indian go? They're being hella disingenuous. And you had a whole bunch of Negroes, since you want to bring up the 5 civilized tribes, most likely they would have participated in white male behavior and raped on some African women. They even got reports of indigenous females buying up African males to sleep with, to replace the indigenous native males that were killed off in battle or sold away to the Caribbean. So these Negroes are being very disingenuous with this West African narrative. But we got to put up with these hoteps that they don't want to listen to history. They only want to hear the victim feel good shit.
Test their Y chromosomes, get a little nervous because, in fact, 30% of the Y chromosomes that we test of African American men are of European ancestry. And so many of them get upset or they are concerned when the match comes back European. You know, I've heard many men say to me, "Well, I'm very dark skinned," or "I'm African. You can just look and see." But you told me that I'm European. What we told you was that your Y chromosome goes back to Europe, meaning that there was
my Y chromosome didn't go back to Europe. It went back to Egypt, to Ramses III, which this nigga, Henry Louis Gates, said ain't no niggas, no Egyptians. So which is it? He's tap dancing for white supremacy. And he's cherry picking DNA. They're cherry picking history. And then on top of that, my genetics also go to 2% Neanderthal. So these niggas are not being genuine on these DNA results, because it can give you some random bullshit and the science isn't there to give Black Americans anything. Only you can trust in with DNA is recent relatives that's in your family tree that goes back 8 generations. It can't go beyond the 8th generations, because you're no longer related to people when it goes further back into the 1700s, unless you got the paper genealogy to prove that you were already in the country before the establishment of the colonies. So These Negroes aren't even telling it right. They're sitting up here telling fake ass shit to people.
European male in your family lineage, and that was part of what we see on your Y chromosome test. It doesn't mean that you're European. It just means that that lineage went back to Europe. And if we were to test 12, 15, 16 lineages, they'll go in many different places because we're a very mixed population. When I perform ancestry testing on myself, what I found was 90% West African ancestry and 9 to 10% European ancestry. So that reflects that 10% of my genome that's of European ancestry. And in fact, a big chunk of that 10% is the Y chromosome because I have one of those 30% of black men who have a European Y chromosome. So having a match that goes back to Europe doesn't mean that you have no African ancestry.
Also, here's another thing. Africans and Europeans' genetics overlap. So this shit is hella pseudo on these Pan-Africans' parts because Africans were in close proximity with Europeans and mixing with them for thousands of years, and Europeans themselves are African nomads. So it's not looking good on these Afrocentrics and even these Native Americans' part because they keep running with this DNA stuff and it don't help their argument whatsoever. It actually kills their argument.
Men have a Y chromosome and an X chromosome, whereas women have 2 X chromosomes. We get these chromosomes from our parents. So for men, we receive the Y chromosome from our father, whereas we all receive the X chromosome from our mother. But with women, they receive an X chromosome from their father as well, which is why they have 2 X chromosomes. So what's special about this Y chromosome? Well, because the Y chromosome and the X chromosome are different, they don't go through a process called recombination. Now, recombination is where the different parts of the 2 chromosome pair or of the chromosome pair just swap together and you end up getting a new chromosome that is passed on to your children. So for instance, my chromosome number 1 is a mixture of the chromosome number 1 that my dad got from his mom and his dad. And my other chromosome number 1 is a mixture of what my mom got from her mom and her dad. Because the X and the Y don't mix, that Y chromosome is passed down from father to son, basically unchanged. Now, there are some natural mutations that happen over time, and this is one of the ways that we can actually date the Y chromosome, but also use that Y chromosome to show branches of the human family. So for instance, my Y chromosome is probably exactly identical to my dad's, which is probably exactly identical to his dad's. Now, if we go back 5 or 10 generations, there might be 1 or 2 small changes in that Y chromosome. And that is going to show that our branch of the family branched off from another branch of the family, 10 years ago. And that is where some of these last names or branches of certain family names come from. If we trace back far enough, we can find that all humans, basically all of the Y chromosomes that we've looked at, go back to an individual around, I think it's 80,000 to 100,000 years ago in East Africa. So everybody alive today is descended from that. And if that Y chromosome didn't,
is descended from that. And if that Y chromosome did not go through mutations, then every male alive today would have that same Y chromosome. But because of 80,000 years of these slight mutations, every 10 to 20 generations or so, we have hundreds and thousands of different Y chromosomes today.
Ancestries that date back to Europe. But when we start looking at people with African ancestry, Asian ancestry, and so on, the data is not quite as reliable because the numbers just aren't there. And there's a lot of intermixing, intermarriages that blend the DNA from these different groups. And crucially, what's most important is that what divides an Irish descendant from an African person is such a tiny fraction of our genome. I mean, all humans are 99.9% identical in their DNA base. So we're looking at one base in 1,000 potential difference between the two most diverse people on the planet. So we have to parse out that and then try to make an interpretation based on statistical frequencies. How often does this particular 1 in 1,000 base occur in these populations in Ireland as opposed to the Gold Coast? And there is no DNA that is unique to any ethnicity. So there's no marker that we can look at and say, okay, this person carries this particular DNA sequence, therefore they must be Irish and nothing else. Everybody overlaps all around the world. So it comes down to a statistic.
So the white man beat this Pan-African bullshit out the water because you can't use DNA to say that somebody is exclusively African. You can't use it at all because all humans overlap. All humans come from the same place. It don't matter if they went through mutation. They are still relatives. So it's not going to give you no specific ethnicity. It's only about migration patterns, nothing more. So these niggas don't even know how to interpret DNA right, but they want to throw it at you like it's a gotcha moment. That's not how DNA works. It's, in their mind, it's just eugenics, pseudoscience.
Analysis. And so people are sometimes disappointed when they see their ethnic breakdown and they say, hey, I'm 2% Asian. Where did that come from? Well, it could just be an anomaly in the statistical analysis. Or perhaps you do have some Asian way back when.
So, Neil, what is the coolest new science thing you've learned to tell me?
I learn cool science things every day, and sometimes I have to be I have to be reminded of them. Maybe I knew them long ago. Yeah. Like we all knew that we have very high common DNA with chimpanzees, with 99% identical. Yeah. And it's okay, I get that. But you know, we also have 50% common DNA with a banana.
I do love bananas. My son, all he eats is bananas.
So it's a monkey time shit.
To get to the bottom of this contradiction, for once and for all, I've invited an expert on Native American history to meet me at Harvard, Dr. Claudio Sant. Claudio, one common belief among African Americans is that the slaves managed to escape from plantations and find refuge with their Native American brothers and sisters. They'd sit around the campfire, slapping five and smoking a peace pipe with cold cheese. Did this happen?
In some cases it happened, but just as often these fugitive slaves were captured by Indians and returned to the planters. And in fact, the colonies had policies. They implemented policies of rewarding Indians who returned fugitive slaves. They might be given 2 guns and a kettle if they brought back a live slave, and half as much if they brought back a dead slave, or rather the 2 ears of a dead slave, which is what they required.
According to Claudio, substantial social contact only occurred in the early colonial era when settlers enslaved Native Americans and African Americans together, and between the Revolution and the Civil War, when a small number of Black people were enslaved by the 5 civilized tribes. If this is true, why does every African American I know believe that their grandmother had high cheekbones and straight black hair?
I think it's probably a desire to be associated with people who are portrayed in popular culture as fierce warriors and who resisted the United States. And if
but
you're
how
a
is it?
slave or
How is it fiction if we actually did? They don't even talk about all them slave rebellions that included indigenous people, like the Yamasee Wars, the Stono Rebellion, which those are Indians, mind you. They don't mention the Seminole Wars, First and Second Seminole Wars. They don't even mention the part that niggas are in the Dancing Rabbit Treaty. They don't mention the Maroons. They don't mention none of that because they're trying to hide that we are owed restitution and reparations from these people. And it's always these buck dancing Negroes that play interference for white supremacy, like Dynasty Amir, like a Henry Louis Gates, like a Rick Kittles, that's sitting up here saying that we're trying to self-hate on a bunch of tethers in Africa that allegedly sold us away when that's not our concern to embrace Africa. And these two individuals, Rick Kittles and Henry Louis Gates, they sit up here and tell you that we should blame Africa for slavery instead of the white man. This man right here, Henry Louis Gates, said in his own article talking about Ron DeSantis and all this other stuff, canceling DEI programs, he said that us demanding reparations is racial bullying white folks. He even was caught in a scandal with the Sony hack years ago. Amy Pascal and all those Jewish producers told this Negro to hide Ben Affleck's slave-owning genealogy. So how the hell are we supposed to take these pro-blackity black Afrocentric niggas seriously if they out here playing defense for white supremacy to prevent us from getting our bag? But you want to sit up here and shame us about, oh, y'all just self-hate Africa. Okay, nigga, that ain't putting no money in our pockets. This self-hate shit comes from your Henry Louis Gates, nigga. He's blaming slavery on your precious so-called African relatives, and he's also dismissing white people's fault for enslaving you right here in the United States and telling you, oh, y'all niggas should just go to Africa and blame the African. Let's continue.
African American living in Jim Crow America, who wouldn't want to be associated with someone like Crazy Horse or Geronimo?
It's easier to say.
But Geronimo and Crazy Horse wasn't in the Southeast. They're out in the plains and they're circus performers of Buffalo Bill's Circus. This is this contradiction right here. Him in the Black Indians documentary.
Millions of native peoples with military aggression and devastating diseases such as smallpox, to which the Indians were not immune. Soon enslaved Africans were brought to North America and put to work on land that had once belonged to native peoples.
Patuxet was one of 60 or more bands that we had in the Wampanoag Nation. The people were wiped out in plagues between 1616 and 1618, which is even before the Pilgrims came. It was of European origin, brought here by fishermen and explorers before the Pilgrims came.
It's quite clear that from
the
first arrival, from the first time that Africans set foot in the Americas, they were intermingling with Native Americans. And the interaction continued, obviously, all the way through Indian removal, and even thereafter, those Indians who stayed in the Southeast were mingling with African Americans.
So if that's the case, it should show up in the genetics. But the reason why it doesn't, because they don't have those DNA samples, and Native Americans are real strict about giving out their ancestral bones. And plus, scientists can't go into your relatives' graveyards and find the shit. So it's disingenuous to even use these DNA companies to prove Indianness whatsoever. So it already body bags these Pan-Africans, African claims, and telling people, oh, you should take a DNA test and let's see what you're African, you're denying African. No, nigga, you're just using that shit to program people into moving with this back to Africa silliness. Now let's get into these pseudo niggas arguing with me about this legitimacy of Kunta Kinte, and we about to end this line soon after because it's getting late. All right, so video.
Let me pass the mic to Afrodamus report. Go ahead, Afrodamus.
All right. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, so I came across this conversation, and I heard some of the people who are of the tribe of anything but African tribe. They've made statements that are incorrect. Since they just want to base it off of books, I'm going to base it off of reality and what I have seen and people I have met. The story about Alex Haley, it is a true story. You know, let me finish. The part they sued him for was because of he described the whole of the sheep, just like of the African. That's the only part. So that's a lie that Afrodamus says in the video. Let's see what he was sued for. Alex Haley was sued for plagiarism in two separate lawsuits regarding his book Roots, one by Harold Corlander, the author of The African, and another by Margaret Walker, author of Jubilee, with Haley settling the lawsuit with Corlander and the lawsuit with Walker being dismissed. Harold Corlander, the anthropologist and author of The African, claimed that Roots contained passages copied from his novel. The lawsuit was settled out of court with Haley acknowledging that passages from The African had found their way into Roots and paying Corlander $650,000, which is the equivalent to $3.1 million in 2024. Margaret Walker, author of Jubilee, claimed that Haley had plagiarized her Civil War era novel. The court dismissed Walker's case, finding no actionable similarities exist between the works, but it actually did because the themes are very similar if you actually read the book. But this individual claimed that he was sued for the slave ship thing, which that's a lie, because when we get into the book, what
Alex Haley So, Alice Haley novel Roots face a plagiarism lawsuit after the author Harold Carlander claimed that passages were taken from his novel The African. Haley settled the suit out of court, acknowledging that the certain passages in Roots were copied from The African. Here are more detailed explanations. The lawsuit in 1978, after the book was turned into a miniseries, Harold Carlander sued Alice Haley, claiming that the passages in Roots were taken from the 1967 novel The African. Haley's response: while Haley denied the intentional plagiarism, he did acknowledge that some sections of Roots seem to have originally appeared in The African. The setting was the case in the settlement was settled out of court with Haley agreeing to pay Carlander a sum of money and acknowledging that certain passages in Roots were copied from The African. Another author, Margaret Walker, also sued Haley. The outcome settlement ended in a 6-week trial. So in 1978, after the book was turned into a legendary movie miniseries, Haley was sued by another author, Harold Carlander, who said that the passages of Roots were taken from his novel, The African. Haley said that he did not plagiarize, but admitted that some sections of Roots seemed to have originally appeared in The African. And they were trying to also question me about Alex Haley documenting his process of how he got in the character for Kunta Kinte on the Black Star Line ship. We'll briefly go through what he wrote about it. So it's from off his website. The title of it is called Aboard the African Star by Alex Haley. September 4th, 2018, articles and essays. After working on the book for more than a decade, Haley was stuck in a desperate, I just love to get out into the ocean. You really are out there thinking in ways you haven't thought before. The best writing ever possibly could do was after the digest helped me go to Africa and Europe. And I was known and I could just take my time and nobody was pressing me. Long Beach, completely around South America and Long Beach. It was 91 days. There's something about a ship. Usually I go out on freight ship, cargo ships. I would get caught on a liner. How can you write with 800 people dancing? The freight ships carry over a maximum of 12 people. They tend to be very quiet people. I work my principal hours from 10:30 at night until daybreak. The world is yours at that point. Most of all the passengers are asleep. I had written from the birth of Kunta Kinte through his capture, and I had gotten into the habit of talking to the character. I knew Kunta Kinte. I knew everything about Kunta. I knew what he was going to do, what he had done, everything. And so I would talk to him. And I had become so attached to him that I knew now I had to put him in a slave ship and bring him across the ocean. That was the next part of the book. And I really couldn't quite bring myself to write that. I was in San Francisco. I wrote 40 pages and chucked it out. When you write well, it isn't a question so much of what you want to say. It's a question of feel. Does it feel like you want to feel it? No, want it to feel. The feel starts coming in somewhere around about the 4th rewrite. I wrote twice more than about 40 pages, threw it out. I realized that what my brother was, I couldn't bring myself to feel. While I was up to writing Kunta Kinte in that slave ship and me in the high-rise apartment, I had to get closer to Kunta. I had run out of my money at the digest line so many times about when I finished, so I couldn't ask for any more. I don't know where I got the money from. I went to Africa, put out the word, and I wanted to get a ship coming from Africa to Florida. I just wanted to simulate the crossing. I went down to Liberia and I got a freight ship called, appropriately enough, the African Star. She was carrying a partial cargo of raw rubber in bales, and I got on as a passenger. I couldn't tell the captain or mate what I wanted to do because they couldn't allow me to do it. But I found one hold that was just about a third full of cargo. There was an enterway into it with a metal ladder down to the bottom of the hole down in there. They had a long, wide, thick piece of rough sawed timber. They called it a dunnage. They used between cargo to keep alive, cargo to keep it from shifting in rough seas. I'm sorry. Yeah, they call it a dunnage and use it between cargo, keep from shifting in rough seas. After dinner, the first night, I made my way down to this hole, and I had a little pocket light. I looked off my clothing, took off my clothing to my underwear, and laid down on my back on this piece of dunnage. I imagine I'm Kunta Kinte. I lay there and I got cold and colder. Nothing seemed to come except how ridiculous it was that I was doing this. By morning, I had a terrible cold and I went back up. The next night, I'm there doing the same thing. Well, the third night, when I left the dinner table, I couldn't make myself go back down in that hole. I just felt so miserable. I don't think I ever felt quite so bad. And instead of going down in the hole, I went to the stern of the ship. And I'm standing up there with my hands on the rail and looking down where the propellers are beating up the white front fourth. And in the fourth are the little luminous green phosphor seeds at sea. You see a lot of that, and I'm standing there looking at it, and all of a sudden it looked like all my troubles just came on me. I owed everybody I knew. Everybody was on my case. Why don't you finish this foolish thing? You ought not to be doing it in the first place, writing the Black genealogy. That's crazy. I was just utterly miserable, didn't feel like I had a friend in the world. And then a thought came to me that I was startling. It wasn't frightening. It's just startling. I thought to myself, hey, there's a cure for all of this. You don't have to go through all this mess. All I had to do was step through the rail and drop in the sea. Once having it, I began to feel quite good about it. I guess I was half a second before dropping in the sea. Fine, that would take care of it. You won't owe anybody anything. To hell with the publishers and the editors. And I began to hear voices. They were not strident. They were just conversational. And I somehow knew every one of them. And they were saying things like, no, don't do that. No, you're just doing your best. You can just keep going. And I knew exactly who they were. They were Grandma Chicken George, Kunta Kinte. They were my cousin Georgia, who lived in Kansas City and had passed away. They were all these people whom I had been writing about. They were talking to me. It was like in a dream. So going down to the paragraph 11, and I was about midnight when kind of got myself together. Then I got up and the feeling was like feeling was you had been asserted and have been tried and you've been approved by all of them who went before. So ahead, and then I went back down in the hole and I had terrible head cold, flu like, and I had with me a long yellow tablet and some pencils. This time I did not take my clothing off like I had been doing. I kept them on because I was having such a bad cold. I lay down on a piece of timber. Now Kunta Kinte was lying in this position on a shelf in a ship of the Lord Ligonier. She had left the Gambia River in July 5th, 1767. She sailed 2 months, 3 weeks, 2 days, destination Annapolis, Maryland, and he was lying there, and others were in there with him whom he knew. And what would he think? What would be some of the things they would say? And then they would come to me in the dark. I would write, and that was how I did every night. Only 10 nights from there to Florida. I remember rushing through the big Miami airport, flew back to San Francisco, got with a doctor, and he kind of patched me up. I sat down with those long yellow tablets and transcribed, and I began to write the chapter in Roots where Kunta Kinte crossed the ocean in a slave ship, and that's probably the most emotional experience I had in the whole thing. So this is what Alice Haley was writing about, experimenting, getting on the African Star from Africa to going to Florida. But in actuality, this man was ripping paragraphs up out of the African. And it wasn't even really him writing it. It was Murray Fisher. So we're going to dig up about Murray Fisher. Of Roots. So I'm reading from Digging into the Tangled Roots of Roots. All right, one of the paragraphs in this thing, it says, Haley's literary and financial success after the publication of the autobiography was married by tax problems, failed marriages, and difficulties with his children. But during the Black Pride era of the 1970s, Haley took the stories of his ancestors and published Roots in 1976. The book that claims to trace his lineage back to West Africa brought Kunta Kinte and his descendants to life and was made into a pioneering TV series that gripped the nation when it aired in 1977. But some question the authenticity of Roots. There were 2 high-profile charges of copyright infringement. Novelist and educator Margaret Walker Alexander sued Haley in 1988, claiming that he copied from her 1966 novel Jubilee, which featured many of the same themes as Roots. The case was dismissed. Folklorist and novelist Harold Corlander sued Haley in 1978 and claimed that Haley had lifted dozens of passages from the 1967 novel The African. The case was eventually settled in Corlander's favor. It doesn't make Haley look very good, but that doesn't mean that Roots isn't more important book for shaping Americans' understanding of slavery. Then there was a devastating piece of Village Voice uncovering Roots in 1993, 1 year after Haley by journalist Philip Noble Noble exaggerates Haley's misdeeds, copying. No, Norrell empathetically states that Noble claims that there was 80 or 90 instances of copying when there was only 3 or 4 instances, and he wrote Haley hid the fact that somebody else wrote most of the book, referring to Murray Fisher, Haley's editor at Playboy. Well, I came across evidence that made it clear that some of the earlier parts of the book probably have more of the authorial voice of Fisher than Haley, but the truth is we don't really know. And where does Norrell weigh in on the controversy? Haley had incorporated a lot of academic research without really citing it. He says his work on the treatment of American slavery is pretty accurate. Now, he's misrepresenting a lot of the African background. But the important thing about the book was that it is said to American readers that African American people have an African past that they don't have to be ashamed of. I thought it was a very substantial contribution. Studying the political and social nuances of race in America has interested Norrell since his childhood. Born in Huntsville, Alabama, he grew up in a family where such matters hit home. My parents were opposite sides of the civil rights movement, he says. My mother was a pretty liberal and my father was a segregationist. Learned towards my mother, and I came out of high school in 1970 knowing that race was the biggest issue in society. The books that made the biggest influences on me were Dan Carter's Scottsboro, blah, 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 blah. Okay, that's it on this shit. But they also made claims about, oh, I went to these people in Africa and these people are more credible than your book. Okay, so according to Just Story, because people want to deny that we are against science and academia, says from Just Story, uprooting Kunta Kinte on the perils of relying on encyclopedic informants by Donald R. Wright. And I posted this on my community wall and tagged them 2 dumb niggas in it. In the late summer of 1976, amid the considerable publicity, Doubleday and Company published Alex Haley's Roots, Saga of an American Family. Almost overnight, the author in the book gained essential validity of the story of Haley's maternal ancestors, which reach back to the Gambia River to the 18th century. Within a few months of the publication of Roots had been serialized for television before a year had passed. Doubleday had sold over 1,500,000 copies of the book. It had gone into translation in several dozen languages. Haley had awarded special Pulitzer Prize, neither for fiction or nonfiction, but for something in between, felicitously denominated faction. The magnitude of Roots' impact makes criticism of the basis of its argument somewhat invidious, but perhaps all the more necessary. One aspect of Roots that added considerably to its popularity was apparent authenticity of the genealogy which Haley used to identify his African ancestors. Haley claimed that largely through oral history, he had proved the existence of his ancestor, one Kunta Kinte, who had been kidnapped into slavery over 200 years ago, but brought directly to the British North American colonies. A decade of diligent searching had made it possible for Haley to piece together basic outlines of his ancestry to nearly everyone who read the book or heard of the story in his quest. Such success in locating his roots in Africa after a century of slavery, another difficult freedom seemed to justify the endeavor respect for Haley's research, sometimes approaching variation appeared in even the most scholarly review. Nearly all reviewers acknowledged or at least passively accepted that Haley had proved beyond reasonable doubt that Kunta Kinte was indeed a real person, was Haley's African ancestry, had lived along the Gambia River, had been kidnapped, enslaved, and shipped to America at a particular time. Of scores of reviews of roots had appeared over the last 4 years. Only a handful had contained a critical criticism of Haley's field research in Africa, which was, after all, the crux on which depended on his entire claim of having located his specific African ancestor. The first, most pointed, most widely read, and most thorough critique on his kind was written by a British journalist, Mark Ottaway, and published in the April 10th, 1977 edition of the Sunday Times of London. After spreading several days investigating in the Gambia, Ottaway identified enough problems in Haley's methodology to conclude that the Gambian section of the story has little basis in provable facts. Ottaway lacked the training in African or oral history methodology, did not keep from making some remarkably sound criticisms, but it may have been one reason the general neglect of what he had to say. Even so, his article seemed to have spawned most of the little scholarly criticism of roots that followed it. Initially, Haley seemed to concede that Ottaway was probably right, but it did not take him long to begin to dispute Ottaway's conclusions, and then simply to ignore the criticisms and watch public interest in it fade away. Since then, Haley has continued to tell the same story of his success in finding his African roots through oral history. It is in large because the scholarly community have been writing to accept, or at least to refrain from rejecting, Haley's conclusions from his African research, and because Haley has been unwillingly to concede in the face of reasonable argument, at least a strong possibility that he did not identify his African ancestor, that I write this paper in addition to a critique of Haley's fieldwork. The paper may be seen as a contribution to debate regarding problems associated with so-called encyclopedic informants. There is no need to dwell on how Haley came to identify Kunta Kinte as his African ancestor, since it had been repeated so often. Where did I lose my place? Repeated so often, Haley learned from his relatives of an ancestor, the African, who called himself Kinte. On the basis of this and a few other remembered words, historians directed Haley to the Gambia area and the Kinte clan. Haley went to the Gambia, where he told some government officials of his grandma's stories, every detail I could remember, as they listened intently, then reacted. These men told Haley of the existence of griots, who he subsequently came to write could tell centuries of the histories of certain very old family clans and the several extended families of Kinte clan living on the Gambia North Bank. The officials pledged their assistance in his quest, and 6 weeks later, they were able to inform Haley that the word had been put out in the back country and that there had indeed been found a griot of the Kinta clan. Haley returned promptly to the Gambia to seek out this griot after employing 14 people and going to the village of Jufere, some 25 miles upriver to the Gambia, capital of Banjul. Haley encountered his informant and a certain Kiba Kanga Fofana, aged about 73, to the accompaniment of Kora and balafon, a harp, lute, and a xylophone. Fofana began reciting the oral history of Kinte clan according to Haley. It came rolling from his mouth across the next hour. 17th and 18th century Kinte lineage details predominantly what men took wives and children they begot in order of their births. Those children's mates and children's events frequently were dated by some proximate singular physical occurrence. It was as if some ancient scroll were printed indelibly within the griot's brain. Haley says Fofana recited for some 5 hours before he even reached the point of discussing Kinte family members. In the middle of the 18th century, it was then that he said what Haley wanted to hear. About the time that the king's soldiers came, the eldest of these 4 sons, Kunta, when he had about 16 reigns, went away from this village to chop wood to make a drum, and he was never seen again. Haley subsequently identified the king's soldiers with a reference in the Public Records Office to Colonel O'Hare's sick forces who had been dispatched to the Gambia in mid-1767 to protect James Fort, the British trading outpost in the river of Jufere. Then, after several weeks of searching in maritime records, Haley found in the ship of the Lord Ligonier, which sailed from July 5th, 1767, from the Gambia with 140 slaves, among other things, for Annapolis. In Washington and Annapolis, Haley found evidence of Lord Ligonier's arrival in the Maryland port in September 29, 1767, along with advertisement in the October 1st, 1767 Maryland Gazette. Reading from the River Gambia in Africa, a cargo of choice, healthy slaves, Haley was convinced by all of this that he had identified his African ancestor beyond reasonable doubt. As it happened, I have particular interest in Haley's African research since I concluded research on the early history of Nuimi, the Mandinka state in which Jufere was located, including 8 months in the Gambia collecting oral traditions. I interviewed 96 griots, family elders, and other persons seemingly knowledgeable about Infumi, and the Western Mandinka history. In addition to consulting various archives, I had spoken to Haley about his African research a few months before I left for my field work, and I had also read an account of his search. So by the time I left for the Gambia, I was reasonably familiar with the way Haley had gone about his work. I remember my initial skepticism of Haley's story. I had studied the Gambia River slave trade in some depth, and I was fairly certain that had some captured a fine young lad from a prominent family in Jufere and sold the captive to the English slaver, there would have been retribution from the ruler of Nuimi on small English garrison on James Island that would have threatened the survival of the outpost. one that would have threatened the survival of the outpost, or even several prime slaves were not worth such a risk to the English there. By the 18th century, the slave trade in the lower Gambia did not work through kidnapping. Still, I was fascinated by Haley's story. It was largely for this reason that fairly soon after I arrived in the Gambia and began interviewing informants of Nuimi history, I traveled to Jufere to the interview Fofana. If he could recite for 5 hours about Kinte genealogy, adding chronological detail and information about specific individuals, then he promised to me be the best informant for my purposes in the entire Senegambia. Though not deeply schooled in oral tradition methodology, I knew that oral historians should find out something about their informants before placing unwarranted credibility in what they said. To my surprise, on inquiring, I had found that Fofana was not a true griot in Mandinka Jali, a member of one of the Ngomus lineages whose tradition functions it is to entertain, to praise, and preserve, recite family and state histories. Instead, Fofana was a member of a family that for years had provided the imam for the village of Jufere. I was told by people who knew something of Fofana's past that he had studied the Quran, higher books of Islamic learning considerably more, and drummed and danced at festive occasions considerably less. In his earlier years, he might indeed have become Jufere's imam. By the time research middle age, however, he was considered not at all suitable to be a religious leader. Actually, it seems he was suited for little else than to become a local entertainer and teller of stories. Thus, he became something of an amateur griot, one who passed on stories heard around evening fires rather than one who, by traditional lot in life, memorized the embellishment long genealogies and family histories handed down for generations. Of course, the fact that Fofana was not a true Jolly does not itself mean that he could not have possessed detailed genealogical information. Some wise and respected family elders who merely listed to others frequently can do a good job of reciting what they have heard and experienced. Certain elderly members in large lineages tended to be better informants for pre-colonial Mandinka history than the griots I've encountered. For pre-colonial Mandinka history than the griots I encountered, who seem more concerned in impressing and listening with their complete knowledge, never admitting they did not know an answer, complete knowledge of admitting they did not know an answer to question, and with getting paid for with the recitals, the elders were usually more interested in their own ancestors, more likely to admit the lack of knowledge, more ready to say where they received their information, and less interested in obtaining something in return. Fofana could have been one of the latter groups. Unfortunately, in my interview with him and subsequent events indicated otherwise. The interview I had with Fofana in September of 1974 was not an occasion of great moment. At the time, he was living with his maternal uncles, who were members of the Kinte family. By his dress and his surroundings, I could tell he was not prospering. If he were a good oral historian, I thought, his patrons were letting him down. Fofana willingly answered questions about the settlement of Jufere, Mount Mandinka traders Jula, and the Gambian River slave trade, and about Muslim diviners. He showed no indication to recite long or short genealogies of any families. He was eager, however, to speak of the Kunta Kinte episode to the extent that in the entire interview of about 1 hour, Kunta Kinte was the only individual about whom Fofana provided any specific information, yet I recorded nothing of the kind of information Haley received before the interview was over. Two inhabitants of Jufere who had been listening to the questions and answers begun responding because of they believe they know some things better than Fofana. The latter yielding his position in front of my microphone, and I finished by speaking solely with one of the Al Haji Darbo, a man who appeared to be better informed than Fofana. When considering Fofana as informant, it is interesting to note what happened on the second trip to Jufere. I returned to the village in December of 1974 to attempt to attain more complete information on the early history of Jufere and of the major families living there. This time, rather than to ask to speak to Fofana, I asked, as I normally did, merely to speak to the persons best versed in the history of the village and its families. I was taken to speak to 4 people. Fofana never came up. I had not already harbored serious doubts about the information Haley received on Kunta Kinte. This would have made me start wondering fairly seriously, after all the Mandinka speakers of the Lower Gambia know whose their histories best, especially on the village level as an informant. Fofana, neither griot nor too highly respected an elder, was clearly second rate. As I continue collecting oral data in the Gambia, and as I continue to study the Western Mandinka and other groups in pre-colonial Senegambia since then, I've come to know considerably about the nature of Mandinka oral traditions and in the methodologies one must use to gather study. The more I am aware of the vital questions one must concern the validity of Haley's African research. These questions involve the very existence of the kind of informant Fofana provided Haley, valid or otherwise, in the oral traditions of the Lower Gambia. They involve 2 fundamental mistakes Haley made when he set out to find information on the African side of the Atlantic that he hoped would supplement his oral traditions. His relatives in America had provided him with the answers to the questions form a generally demanding indictment of Haley's claim of providing an existence of an 18th century Jufere of an ancestor named Kunta Kinte. From often disappointing experience, I've learned that there is not considerable amount of specific, reliable oral data available from informants in the Senegambia, and in particular from the Mandinka speakers in the region around the north bank of Lower Gambia. It was in this area that I was concentrated by interviewing. I spent much of my time asking informant griots, elders, and anyone else who professed to have knowledge of Chosan and past literally old things for specific information. Any individuals in pre-colonial history of the region was particularly interested in obtaining stories about Nuimi Mansa, that state's ruler, who were the most important and consequently the best remembered individuals in the pre-colonial history of the region. From the entire group of my informants, I was able to obtain several stories of the clearly mythical founders of the states. I also recorded the seemingly allegorical story of the Nandanoko Sonoko, who held the office of Mansa and Nuimi in 1760. Beyond that, and no counting Fofana's story of Kunta Kinte, the next specific information was the Mansa who sold Banjul Island to the British around 1815. After the Mansa are remembered more frequently, informants able to recite stories about persons in Nuimi's history other than Mansa, who lived after about the middle of the 19th century. Oral traditions of the Lower Gambia simply do not contain specific information about real people living before the 19th century, except now. Of course, for the story of Kunta Kinte, which has worked its way into the body of Nuimi's oral traditions, as a result of great exposure it has received beyond this, it is quite incredible that anyone would remember a story about a 16-year-old boy, however outstanding, when no one remembers stories about anyone else, including older men and leaders of the society from that time on or much later still, even if such information as Haley received from Fofana did exist, from Fofana did exist, and it might altogether be presumptuous of me to assert that it does not exist simply because I did not record comparable data in a fairly thorough canvas of Nuimi's oral traditionalists. Certain aspects of Haley's methodology in seeking, obtaining, and using information render it unworthy in credence. In fact, the description Haley provides of how he went about getting the story of Kunta Kinte in the Gambia is a virtual scenario of how not to conduct field work in the oral societies. Haley's first error was to tell his story in great detail to nearly everyone he met in the Gambia, since in doing so, he made it all too clear just what he hoped to hear in return. From this point, his own oral traditions was available for others to hear and pass it on. Therefore, he could never know if what he was be hearing from an informant would be the echo of his own story retold with additions and embellishments, or a story handed down locally over the generations. To most Westerners, Mandinka orals, historians, griots, especially appear to have different and often quite flexible concepts of historical accuracy. I encountered few griots whose speciality it was to recall and recite, who failed to recall and recite. However, much conjuring of a good or just fair story had to be done. In fact, the traditional role of the story had to be done. In fact, official oral historians in Mandinka society was at all to remember various genealogies in pure form of historical events just as they occurred. Well, I'm not going to read the rest of this shit. Y'all can look it up on Uprooting Kunta Kinte on the Perils of Relying on the Encyclopedic Informants, Donald R. Wright, on Just Story, Just Make You an Account. And with that, I'm about to turn in. We can continue this in a part 2, but it's just interesting how these Negroes just take what little evidence they can run with and try and ridicule and accuse people of self-hatred with no proof and no scholarship, just prison babble. But with that, we out of here.